Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SRHM Podcast, which explores new research and emerging trends in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on using rights-based knowledge for action.
Welcome to the SRHM Podcast. I'm Eszter Kismodi, Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. And I'm really very pleased to welcome here today Lara van Kouterik, Interim Co-CEO and Director of Strategy, Evidence and Impact at Girls, Not Brides. Welcome in the program, Lara.
Thank you very much.
So we are talking about your most recently published blog with us on the 17th of June. That was recorded by the former CEO, Dr. Faith Mwangi-Powell, former Chief Executive Officer of Girls Not Brides. That is titled, "We Know What Works, So Why Cannot We Build Architecture to Make It Last?" Before going into the details that I find very exciting, very relevant, and so timely, can you just, Lara, give a little bit of introduction about yourself and the organization?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me today. I work with Girls Not Brides, which is the global partnership to end child marriage. So we are a partnership of over 1,400 civil society organizations across nearly 100 countries, working together to end child marriage. That's our goal, ending child marriage. Dr. Faith Mwangi-Powell is our outgoing CEO, former CEO, has written about what is needed to end child marriage is funding and is the architecture to make a sustainable change. 1 in 5 girls globally at the moment is getting married before the age of 18. And as Girls Not Brides, what we're doing is to build partnerships to end that, both at global level. So really looking at how we sustain global action on this issue by mobilizing the international ecosystem, getting the political commitment and the international funding in place to then make the ultimate impact at country level. So we also work together with our members at country level to build national coalitions and national movements to end child marriage, really focusing on how civil society can play a critical role in that.
So the blog is situating us in the current development world when development budgets are shrinking, needs are rising, and the whole development world is reshifting around funders, and we are trying to understand how to operate within this framework. And funders, and the reality is that the funders are demanding greater impact for every dollar spent, as you point out in your blog. That is bringing the sector to a difficult question. If we know what works, why are we still struggling to sustain it? And you are very sharp in your blog to point out that if short-term project-driven funding can really deliver lasting change, and all of us are struggling to show impact and proven solution at the end of each grant cycle. Can you just go deeper into the problem? What does it show us? What is the problem with this?
Yes, of course. And I think we all know in the past sort of 12 to 18 months, we've seen dramatic cuts to international development aid. But we also know that even before those cuts, only less than 0.02% of ODA was going directly towards ending child marriage.
When you say what is ODA?
Official development assistance. So all the funding that is given by governments as part of their development assistance. So less than 0.02%. So that is less than $1 per girl at risk of ending child marriage. So we know that even before cuts, the funding to end child marriage was very small. And we have seen some real impacts of the recent cuts as well. So And we know, for example, from the UNICEF UNFPA Global Program to End Child Marriage, which is one of the largest investments, multi-country initiatives to end child marriage. And they were able to reach 4 million girls less in 2025 than they were in 2024. And it has a real impact on girls. And it means the shutting down of programs, of essential services, the loss of trained staff, for example, across programs, and leaving millions of girls extra at risk of child marriage every year. I think what is really important to look at is, obviously that is an immediate crisis, but even when the funding is in place, how do we make sure that we really sustain the progress we have been made? So we know at the moment what needs to happen to end child marriage, but what we see very often in this sector is that interconnected challenges around a girl's life are often addressed in separate sort of silos. If you think about a girl, she might be at risk of marriage, she might be at risk of dropping out of school, she might be at risk of early pregnancy, she might be at risk of violence. And all of these risks are addressed separately by different actors in different programs, through different funding cycles, through different intermediaries. And especially when funding becomes more constrained, these silos become even more pronounced because there becomes more competition, more need to specialize to see what every dollar sort of brings you. So I think this is one of the challenges that we really see, is that we were making progress. Funding cuts are really affecting how many girls we can reach and what can be done. But it also further sharpens the sort of siloing and sort of fragmented approach that we are actually trying to avoid.
And Lara, as I understand from your blog, I mean, and as we know, it's not only about the reshifting of the development work, but how the funding works. And child marriage is one of the examples when it sits in the intersection, as you say, in poverty, inequality, conflict, and gender discrimination. You cannot show impact within a year. The progress is slow, it's real, it's uneven and fragile. So how do you imagine, what are the needs of reimagine new infrastructure, new architecture that could possibly work? And when the development world is reshifting anyway, how do we think about that this siloed approach is replaced something more sustainable and impactful that is not measured in every 12 months necessarily sharp impacts?
So yeah, you're right. Child marriage is one of those issues that really sit at the intersection of poverty, gender discrimination, inequality, conflicts, education. So all real issues that affect a girl's lives and that increase her risk of getting married before her 18th birthday. I think when we think about how do we shift that architecture, I think what's really important is to start with the girls that we want to reach. And child marriage, I think, is one of the issues because it sits at that intersection. It is a lens we can use to really look at, okay, if these are all the risks that a girl faces during her childhood and her teenage and her adolescent years, how can we address them in a sort of connected and holistic way? And that means not working through sort of individual problem channels, but really using an ecosystem, what we would call an ecosystem approach. So looking at all the risks that a girl faces and make sure that we work together with all actors that work within those different sectors to coordinate, to make sure that we all work from an evidence base that is shared, that is commonly understood, but also really making sure that we are not overlapping, that we're coordinating where investment goes and really streamline investment across the ecosystem. So for us, that really means making sure that child marriage is integrated within all those sectors. So when we think about girls' education, we think about ending child marriage. When we think about girls' sexual reproductive health and rights, we think about child marriage, and really making sure that we come together as international actors, but also at national level to build those connections and to basically be together behind shared goals and really looking at who does what, when, and where.
Can you give possibly an example? And so as far as I understand what you are saying, that the ecosystem investment works across programs, across organizations, across government and non-governmental sectors. Can you give an example? You used one example in India that prevalence fell from 49% in 2001 to 23% in 2021.
Yeah, so I think when you look at countries where child marriage has decreased most prominently, India is a very good example. India has seen, as you said, dramatic decrease in child marriage prevalence over the last 20 years or so, because India is so big. 1/3 of the child brides globally live in India. But if you look at what drove progress in India, it is really that sort of interconnected multi-sectoral response. And I think in the case of India, that was partly because girls' education attainment went up in the past 20 years. So there has been a lot of investment, both from the Indian government, but also from international development partners on girls' education. But at the same time, there were opportunities for girls to then enter into the labor market as well. I think this is a crucial incentive also for education, if there's job and economic opportunities after school. And we saw a lot of investment into social protection, so large-scale programs with governments on that. And at the same time, also laws change. So, and partly because of some of these structural changes, but also really making sure that if the school is there, if the opportunity for girls to go to school, to go into work, to go into economic life, are there, that it's not the norms within her own family of community that hold her back or that then become barriers. So India has seen that progress. What we haven't seen is that sort of at scale in many other countries, and that is partly because of global growing inequality in the world, stalling economic progress, etc. But to give you an example, one of the things that we are in the past 18 months is to, for example, in Malawi, really bring together that ecosystem. So about 2 years ago, we saw real political momentum in Malawi. We had a president who publicly committed to ending child marriage in his country. And obviously that's great. That's the first step. But then if they don't have the resources and the infrastructure to do that, it will stay with commitment and not implementation. So one of the things that Girls Not Brides has been piloting and really been advocating for is to bring that ecosystem approach to Malawi. What we've seen in those 2 years is a real partnership with the government to develop that commitment into a national strategy. So the government has developed a national strategy to end child marriage with now a concrete implementation plan attached to that as well. We have seen reactivation of some of those coordination platforms. So there is, for example, a multi-sectoral government-led coordination platform in Malawi that was dormant for many years, is now activated again. It's the real place where that coordination happens. But we've also seen increased investment. So a large international funder just launched a 20 million investment into ending child marriage in the country in partnership with the president. So that sort of work of like, let's all focus on a shared goal in one place has really shown some early results already.
You mentioned trust-based philanthropy rather than. So what does trust-based philanthropy mean, and how can it be done?
I think it means moving away from very rigid sort of funding, right? So funding that is very targeted towards one specific outcome, very clear targets, and is very limiting in the sense that it doesn't allow you to learn. It doesn't allow you to, for example, invest in these coordination mechanisms that are crucial, but don't always directly relate to a girl being saved from marriage, for example. So I think trust-based philanthropy means the openness and the understanding that change doesn't happen overnight, that change requires coordination, that change requires partnership, investing in that, understanding that change, as I said, doesn't happen overnight and isn't always, you're not always able to count that within 12 months or 24 months. Sometimes you do need to look at like, what are the pathways to that change, and how can we measure the progress on those pathways? And I think it also means trusting funding to those who are closest to. So that means women's rights, girl-led organizations, civil society that is really at the heart of the communities where the girls live that we're trying to impact.
So my last question would be exactly about that, for example, in Malawi, in this strategy, was it a strategy in India to work with the girls themselves and the families and the communities? And that obviously it requires cultural change, attitude change, working with men, working with boys. How does it work in programs when you see success?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, yes, it does. As I was talking earlier, I think particularly when we talk about norms, right? Like how and the barriers that girls face within their own families or within their own communities to maybe access or go to school, to have a healthy life, basically to thrive in life. Those are exactly the moments where working with communities and with families and that sort of girl-led work is really important. Because without that, you can build all the schools, you can build all the hospitals, you can give all the services. But if there's barriers within a girl's own family community, she still won't be able to access it. And what we see is that, especially when it comes to child marriage, reasons for child marriage can be very different across communities, across different regions within a country. So it is those organizations who work in those communities who know exactly what the risks are that girls face within that community. And so particularly when it comes to ensuring access, removing barriers within families and communities, that's at work with grassroots organization is crucial.
Lara, just one more question so it requires generational change and education and communication at all levels, but we also see that conflict war can also drive back results that we saw in Syria, Lebanon, and other places. So how do you counter in the conflict, the humanitarian crisis, and how do you see when there is a sustainable change and suddenly there is a fall because of unexpected circumstances? How do you count it in your programming?
It is. This is a real challenge at the moment in the current world that we live in, with increasing conflicts and crisis. Not just conflict, but also climate crisis, other crises that are affecting communities. So, and we know that girls who live in conflict or crisis affected areas are much more likely to be child brides. So, as I said at the beginning, 1 in 5 girls globally is getting married. When you look at conflict and crisis settings, it goes up to 1 in 3 girls. And what we see very often is that when systems weaken, when crisis hits, it is often girls and women who are first affected. So what we are doing around that is, first of all, really looking at how can we integrate child marriage prevention into humanitarian responses. So at the moment, it isn't firmly sort of embedded into one of the clusters within humanitarian response. And so that is one, like really looking and embedding that into systems, so that the first response, of course, is food security, health, etc. But that we're also making that risk assessment for girls. Like, are they at risk of getting married, and how do we prevent? How do we, for example, set up safe spaces for girls?
It's interconnected, right?
Exactly.
Girls marry because they need food security, because they need survivors. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But there's also situations of what we would call more like protected crisis. So, for example, we know because of climate change, because of extreme weather events, girls can be more at risk of marriage. And that is particularly in cases where food security is impacted or where economic hardship is growing because of that. So, and that is worrying, because it does mean that in this global context we are at the moment, that yes, we have seen progress to end child marriage. Yes, we know what needs to happen to end it. But we also see the risk of progress stalling. And that's why it's so important to really invest into this and to really even work between development and humanitarian sectors to reach those girls.
So, Lara, as a last question, why the problem is huge and it's impacting so many girls around the world. Both the blog and as you are talking is optimistic. So, where your optimism lies, especially from the donor development perspective?
I think my optimism lies in a few things. One, we know change is possible. We've seen change happen. And we know what needs to be done. And we have seen dramatic declines of child marriage in specific contexts. And we also know that there is, even within the donor community, there is growing sort of understanding of that need for integrated approaches. So I think the two ingredients are there, and it's about meeting them now. And that does give me optimism. I think what also gives me optimism is the work that I see that our 1,400 members across 100 countries are doing, even with very little funding. Most grassroots organizations, even if they don't have a lot of funding, they will continue to work, which means that there is a real movement of very committed activists working together on child marriage. And I think it just needs a small boost to really multiply that effect and reach the goals that we want to reach.
Thank you so much, Lara, for this podcast conversation and also for the blog and for your great work. And we are looking forward to receive more documentation about what works, how it works. The SRHM journal has different type of articles, research articles, practice articles as well, documenting good programs, and also to hear more in our blog space as well. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this insightful conversation. Please check the show notes for a link to the SRHM Journal, which is available online and open access. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to receive notifications for new publications. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, give us a rating, or leave a review. Sharing evidence-based and rights-grounded knowledge is our passion, and it's also critical to support the advocacy and actions that need to be taken to improve SRHR for all. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the SRHM Podcast, which is produced by our staff. The music was composed by Tiber Christian and Salomon Beautond.